hell is this? The words tear from my throat before I can stop them, raw and sharp, slicing through the stale hospital air like a dagger. My voice trembles, not with fear, but with something far worse, a rage so visceral, so suffocating, that for a moment I can't even breathe. The scene before me is grotesque, obscene in its audacity. The hospital bed, the one I imagined cradling his supposedly frail, suffering body, is nothing more than a twisted stage for betrayal. The pristine white sheets, meant to be a symbol of care and healing, are tangled around them, stained with the heat of their deception. His hands I once traced with my fingertips, memorizing every line, every callus, are gripping her hips, fingers pressing into her skin as if she belongs to him. The woman straddling him, Ms. Abrams, his attending physician, the one who always spoke to me in hushed, sympathetic tones about his condition, turns her head sharply at my outburst. Her eyes go wide, lips parting in shock, but she doesn't move. Neither does he. For a single, unbearable second, the world stands still. Then, chaos. He shoves her off, scrambling to sit up, his face contorting into something between panic and irritation, as if my presence is the problem here. As if I am the intruder. "Babe, it's not what it looks like," he stammers, breathless, his chest heaving from the exertion of… what? His supposed illness? Or the effort of his betrayal? Not what it looks like. The words are so ridiculous, so insultingly cliché, that I almost laugh. Almost. But there's nothing funny about this. Nothing funny about spending sleepless nights by my phone, terrified that he wouldn't make it, that the illness was too much. Nothing funny about breaking myself apart to be strong for him, to shoulder the weight of his suffering, only to realize that the suffering was a lie. My hands shake at my sides. I clench them into fists, my nails digging into my palms so hard it hurts, but I welcome the pain. It reminds me that this is real, that I'm standing here, in this hospital room, watching my husband betray me in the most unforgivable way possible. Miss Abrams finally moves, pulling the sheet around herself, her face burning with guilt. But she doesn't apologize. She doesn't beg for forgiveness. She just stares, as if she's waiting for me to leave, as if she's already decided that she is the one who belongs here, and I am the outsider. I turn my gaze back to him, to the man I loved, the man I sacrificed for, the man who looked me in the eye, week after week, and lied to my face. "How long?" I demand. My voice is eerily calm, but inside I am unraveling. He rubs a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "It's not… how… long?" I spit the words out like venom, and this time there's no escaping them. He hesitates, and that hesitation alone is another knife in my chest. Finally, he mutters, "A few months." A few months. I let out a breath, a slow, shuddering exhale that sounds almost like a laugh. Except it isn't a laugh. It's the sound of something breaking. I shake my head. And the illness? The treatments? The sleepless nights? The fucking pity? He doesn't answer, because we both know the answer. A cold, horrible realization slams into me like a freight train, stealing whatever air I had left in my lungs. The pieces fall into place, sharp and cruel. The fatigue, the hospital stays, the IV drips. It was all a cover, a convenient excuse to be here, to be with her. I take a step back, swallowing against the bile rising in my throat. "You never had cancer, did you?" His jaw tightens, and that silence is my answer. The room tilts. My stomach lurches. My body knows the truth before my mind fully processes it. My husband, the man I fought for, cried for, nearly destroyed myself for, has been lying to me for months. No, longer. A bitter laugh escapes me, hoarse and ragged. I clutch the edge of the hospital bed, grounding myself against the spinning void inside me. "You absolute fucking coward." His face darkens. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" My voice rises, cracking under the weight of betrayal. "What kind of person fakes cancer? Who does that?" He looks away, jaw clenched, as if he's the one who has the right to be angry. As if he's the victim here. My pulse roars in my ears. My hands are shaking so violently that I have to press them against my sides to steady myself. I need to get out of here. If I stay a second longer, I might lose control completely. I spin on my heel, heading for the door, but just as I reach it, a voice, Ms. Abrams' voice, cuts through the suffocating tension. "Wait!" I don't want to wait. I don't want to hear a single word from her, but something in her tone, something almost apologetic, makes me pause. "You should know." She hesitates, glancing at him, then back at me. "He was discharged 3 weeks ago." The air leaves my lungs. I blink. "What?" She swallows. "He wasn't supposed to be here anymore. His tests were clear. He could have gone home 3 weeks ago." The world blurs at the edges. My heart, already bruised and battered, clenches one final time before shattering completely. 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, I sat at home, worrying, praying, losing sleep over a man who had already been free. A man who stayed here not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because this is where she was. The betrayal was bad enough. But this is beyond cruelty. I don't know what expression crosses my face in that moment, but it's enough to make him flinch. Enough to make Miss Abrams look away, shame coloring her features. I nod, slow and deliberate, pressing my lips together to keep them from trembling. "Good to know," I murmur, my voice eerily steady. Then, without another word, I turn and walk away. I don't run. I don't scream. I don't cry. Not yet. Because the storm brewing inside me is far from over, and for the first time in my life, I am done being the one left behind. I used to believe in forever. With him, it always felt that way, like we were untouchable, like nothing in this world could break us. He wasn't just my love. He was my best friend, my partner in every sense of the word. The person who knew me better than I knew myself. I still remember the first time I saw him. It wasn't some grand, cinematic moment where the world stopped spinning and our eyes locked across a crowded room. No, it was something simpler, warmer, real. It was raining that day, the kind of rain that wasn't heavy but persistent, drizzling just enough to soak into your skin and make you shiver. I had forgotten my umbrella, of course, and was stuck under the awning of a tiny cafe, watching people rush by, huddled under their own protection from the storm. And then, out of nowhere, a black umbrella appeared over my head. Didn't take you for the kind of person who enjoys getting drenched. I turned, surprised, and there he was, grinning at me, his eyes filled with something mischievous yet warm. We had met before, in passing, through mutual friends, but that was the first time he truly looked at me. That was the moment everything changed. From that day on, he became a constant in my life. It was effortless with him, like breathing. We would talk for hours about everything and nothing, laughing over things no one else would find funny, stealing moments between the chaos of everyday life just to be together. He made the ordinary feel extraordinary. He used to leave me little notes, everywhere. In my books, in my pockets, in my bag, tiny scribbles of affection, inside jokes, reminders that I was loved. "You looked beautiful this morning. Don't forget to eat. Missing you already." They were silly, sometimes ridiculous, but they made me feel seen, cherished, and I adored him for it. Our love was built in quiet moments as much as grand gestures. The late-night talks under the covers when the world outside didn't matter. The way he would pull me closer in his sleep, as if even unconscious, he couldn't bear to be apart. The way he made my coffee just right, memorizing every tiny detail of how I liked it. 2 sugars, just a little milk, stirred counterclockwise because I swore it tasted better that way. I would have done anything for him. And for a long time, I thought he felt the same way. He wasn't just my love, he was my home, and I took care of him like one. When he was sick, I was the one who made sure he had everything he needed. When he was stressed, I was his safe place, his comfort. When he had doubts, I reminded him of his worth, and he did the same for me. Or at least, I thought he did. I remember one night when I had a panic attack. It came out of nowhere, creeping up on me like a shadow I couldn't shake. My chest tightened, my hands shook, my thoughts raced too fast for me to catch. He found me sitting on the floor, curled in on myself, trying to breathe. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down beside me and held my hand, rubbing slow, soothing circles into my palm. "I'm here," he whispered. "Just breathe, love. I'm here." And somehow, just knowing that was enough. I trusted him completely. So when he got sick, I never once doubted him. It started slowly. Fatigue, headaches, weight loss. Nothing drastic at first, but enough for me to worry. He brushed it off, of course. Said it was just stress, that he'd been overworking himself. But I knew him. I knew when something wasn't right. I remember the exact moment he told me. We were sitting on the couch, his fingers laced with mine, his grip just a little too tight. He wouldn't look at me at first. And then, finally, with a breath that seemed to shake his whole body, he said the words that shattered me. I have cancer. Everything inside me went still. I didn't cry. Not at first. I just held on to him, tighter than ever, as if I could somehow shield him from it, as if my love alone could keep him safe. I promised him, right then and there, that we would get through it together, that I would never leave his side, and I didn't. I became his rock, his anchor. I researched every possible treatment, made sure he ate even when he had no appetite, stayed up with him on the nights he couldn't sleep, held him when he broke down. And through it all, I never once doubted his love for me. He still left me notes, even when he was too tired to do much else. Thank you for being my light. I don't know what I'd do without you. I love you more than anything. I held on to those words like lifelines, believing them with everything I had. He made me believe in forever. And then, just like that, he took it away. Looking back now, I wonder how much of it was real. Was there ever a moment, even one, where he meant those words? Or was it all part of the lie? I remember how he would look at me when I wasn't watching, the softness in his eyes. I remember how he held me like I was the most precious thing in his world. I remember how he made me feel safe. And I don't know what's worse, the possibility that it was all a lie, or the fear that for a time it wasn't, that once he really did love me. And then, somehow, he stopped, and I never even saw it coming. I never doubted him, not once. Even when things started to feel off, I brushed it aside. I had no reason to question him. How could I? He had always been good to me, always treated me like I was the most important person in his world. And now, with his illness consuming him, it made sense that things would be different, that he would be different. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The first time I felt something was wrong, it was small. Insignificant, really. He had started staying overnight at the hospital more often, and while I hated seeing him suffer, I trusted the doctors knew what was best. One evening, I decided to surprise him. I stopped by the hospital on my way home, carrying his favorite soup from the little place down the street. But when I got there, he wasn't in his room. I remember standing in that sterile, dimly lit space, holding the warm container in my hands as a nurse came in to check his chart. He went for tests, she told me, barely glancing up. That made sense. Of course it did. But something about the way she said it, distracted, unbothered, left a strange feeling in my stomach. Do you know when he'll be back? I asked. She frowned, flipping a page. Oh, actually, he's not scheduled for anything tonight. I blinked. Then where is he? She hesitated, then offered an apologetic smile. Maybe just getting some air? Sometimes patients like to walk around the halls. It helps. That explanation should have put me at ease, but it didn't. I stayed in his room, waiting, my hands wrapped around the cooling soup container. It was nearly 40 minutes before he returned. Oh, he said when he saw me. You're here. I forced a smile. Where were you? He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. If I hadn't been watching him so closely, I might have missed it. Just walking, he said, crossing the room to kiss my forehead. I needed to clear my head. That was reasonable, understandable, but there was something about the way he avoided my gaze, the way his hand brushed through his hair, a nervous tic he always had, that unsettled me. I let it go. It wasn't the only time things felt strange. There were the phone calls. Late at night, when he thought I was asleep, he always kept his voice low, just a murmur through the walls, too soft for me to make out the words. I never pressed him about them. What kind of wife would I be if I made him feel like he couldn't talk to someone? He was sick. He was allowed to have his moments of vulnerability. But still, doubt began to creep in. One night, I woke up to the faint glow of his phone screen, the light reflecting against the ceiling. His back was turned to me, his body tense as he whispered into the receiver. Yeah, I know, he said. No, not yet. Soon. My stomach twisted. I shifted slightly in bed, letting the blankets rustle just enough for him to hear. He went silent immediately. Then, a soft click as he ended the call. I didn't say anything. I just closed my eyes and pretended I hadn't noticed. But I did. Then there was the way he started pulling away. It wasn't obvious at first. Just little things, missed calls, shorter replies to my texts. When I came to visit, sometimes he'd be distant, like he was lost in his own world. It's just the treatments, he told me once, after I finally asked why he seemed so exhausted. They're taking a lot out of me. That made sense. But then, there was the cologne. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but I knew the scent well. It wasn't his. It wasn't even mine. It was floral, something delicate and sweet. The first time I caught it, I thought maybe it had rubbed off from a nurse, or maybe someone had sprayed perfume nearby. Hospitals had people coming and going all the time. But then it happened again. And again. Each time, that same faint trace of a scent that didn't belong to me. I wanted to ask. God, I wanted to ask. But I didn't. Because how could I? He was sick. He was struggling. And what kind of person would I be if I questioned him? If I doubted him when he needed me most? So I ignored it. I ignored the creeping sense of unease that twisted in my gut. I ignored the way my heart clenched every time he came up with another excuse for why he couldn't come home for the weekend, why his treatments were taking longer than expected. I ignored all of it, because I loved him. And love, I told myself, meant trust. But now, standing in the ruins of that trust, I wonder, was I blind? Or did I just not want to see? The apartment felt hollow the moment I stepped inside. The air was stale, untouched for weeks, yet it carried the weight of memories that clung to the walls like shadows. The place I once called home, the place we built together, now felt foreign, suffocating. My hands trembled as I flicked on the light, illuminating a space that was no longer mine. Everything in here had been touched by him. The couch where we'd curled up on lazy Sundays, tangled in each other's warmth. The kitchen where he'd made me breakfast, humming off-key to songs he barely knew. The bed, God, the bed, where I had held him through his worst nights, whispering promises that had meant everything to me. Lies. It was all a lie. A sharp, burning lump formed in my throat, but I refused to cry. Not here. Not in this place where I had loved him so completely, where I had poured every part of myself into someone who didn't deserve it. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, methodical, detached. I grabbed my suitcase from the closet and threw it open, forcing myself to pack. Clothes, books, shoes. I didn't care about order, didn't care about neatness. I just wanted to be gone. Then I saw his shirt. Crumpled at the foot of the bed, one I had stolen from him so many nights, wrapping myself in the scent of comfort, of love. My fingers clenched around the fabric, and for the first time, the tears threatened to spill over. I dropped it. I didn't want anything of his. I yanked open drawers, shoving away anything that wasn't mine. Every photo, every note, every stupid little trinket that once held meaning. I gathered it all in a box and shoved it into the back of the closet. Out of sight. Out of my life. I didn't even stop to breathe. I just kept moving, afraid that if I did, I'd shatter completely. By the time I was done, the apartment looked untouched, like I had never lived here at all, like I had been erased. Good. I walked out without looking back. The road stretched endlessly before me, winding away from the city, from the suffocating weight of betrayal. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but I barely noticed. I just needed to get away. The small house nestled deep in the woods had always been my escape, a quiet place I had bought long before him, back when I still believed solitude was something I wanted. It was supposed to be a retreat, a space for me and me alone. And now, it was all I had left. By the time I reached it, the sky had darkened, casting long shadows between the towering trees. The house was silent, untouched, exactly as I had left it months ago. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me as if that alone could keep the world out. Then, finally, I let go. The suitcase hit the floor with a dull thud, and I sank down beside it, pressing my hands to my face as the tears finally came. Silent at first, then violent. Sobs racked through me, my body trembling from the force of it. My chest ached, my throat burned, and yet the pain inside me refused to lessen. He was gone. Or maybe he had never been mine to begin with. The realization clawed at my ribs, hollowing me out from the inside. How could I have been so blind? How could I have loved someone so much, only to be discarded like I was nothing? I had given him everything, and in return, he had left me with nothing but lies. I curled up on the floor, exhaustion pressing heavy against my limbs. The room around me was dark, the only sound my own uneven breathing. I should call someone. I should tell someone. But I didn't want to. I didn't want comfort. I didn't want to be told I would be okay. I just wanted to disappear for a while, to feel everything, to grieve the man I thought I loved. The next morning, the sun barely pierced through the thick canopy of trees outside. The world continued, indifferent to my suffering. I stayed in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, my body weighed down by the sheer heaviness of it all. The house was eerily quiet, and for once, I didn't mind. No phone calls, no messages, no one checking in to ask if I was okay. I didn't want to be okay. I wanted to exist in this grief, to let it consume me. But as the days stretched on, something inside me began to shift. At night, I would sit by the window, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. The silence that once felt like a comfort now felt like a presence, pressing against me, whispering truths I had ignored. I had given too much of myself away. I had made him my whole world, and now, without him, I didn't even know who I was. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. I wasn't ready to move on, not yet, but I knew I couldn't stay like this forever. I had to figure out who I was, without him, and maybe, just maybe, that was the one thing he never took from me. The days blurred into weeks, and I let them. No calls, no messages, nothing. And I preferred it that way. I hadn't spoken to anyone since leaving the city, hadn't felt the need to explain my absence. Maybe people assumed I needed space, or maybe they just didn't care enough to check in. Either way, I embraced the silence. It was easier this way, just me and the stillness of the forest, no expectations, no forced conversations, no reminders of what had happened. I spent most of my time inside, drifting between the couch and the bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. But today, for some reason, I needed to get out. Maybe it was the way the golden morning light filtered through the trees, the crisp autumn air whispering against my window, calling me outside. Maybe it was the suffocating weight of my own isolation, pressing down harder than usual. So I walked. The woods behind my house stretched endlessly, a maze of towering trees and winding trails. I didn't have a destination, just the need to move, to feel something other than the dull ache that had settled inside me. The leaves crunched beneath my boots, the air rich with the scent of damp earth and pine. Birds called from the branches above, their songs weaving into the quiet rustling of the wind. For the first time in weeks, I almost felt, okay. And then, bang! The shot rang out so suddenly, so violently, that it sent a shockwave through my body. A sharp, deafening explosion that shattered the tranquility of the forest. I barely had time to react before instinct took over. My breath hitched, and before I could stop myself, a scream ripped from my throat. My knees buckled, and I crouched low, pressing myself against the nearest tree, heart hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. What the hell? For a terrifying moment, my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Was someone hunting me? Had I walked into something dangerous? Footsteps. Fast. Heavy. Someone was coming. I turned, my pulse spiking, just as a man burst through the trees. Tall. Broad shoulders. A strong, powerful frame wrapped in a dark flannel and worn jeans. His sharp jawline was dusted with stubble, his piercing blue eyes scanning me with concern. He was holding a rifle, one he quickly lowered the second he saw me. "Jesus!" he exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "Are you okay?" I was still too rattled to answer. He took a cautious step closer, studying me. "I didn't mean to scare you. I was hunting. I didn't realize anyone was out here." Hunting. The word settled something inside me. My breath steadied slightly, though my hands were still shaking from the adrenaline. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to straighten. I exhaled sharply. "You could have killed me." His expression twisted with guilt. "Yeah, I know, and I feel like an asshole for it." He glanced down at his rifle before slinging it over his shoulder. "I usually don't shoot this close to the main trails, but I thought I was alone. Guess we both did." I studied him, still wary, but something about him didn't seem threatening. He wasn't just some reckless idiot firing off shots without a second thought. He seemed controlled, measured. I crossed my arms, my pulse still unsteady. "You live out here?" He nodded, jerking his thumb over his shoulder. "Not far, about a mile west. I've been here a few years now. Thought I knew all my neighbors, but I've never seen you before." His gaze held curiosity, but not prying. I hesitated before responding. "I haven't been here in a while." He nodded as if he understood more than I was saying. "Figured. Your place looked empty." That took me by surprise. "You've seen my house?" He let out a short, amused breath. "Hard not to. You're the only other person living this deep in the woods. I just assumed it was a vacation home or something." I didn't respond. The truth was, I didn't even know what my house was to me anymore. A retreat? A hiding place? A place to mourn the life I thought I had? He must have sensed my reluctance because he shifted the conversation. "I'm Peter, by the way." There was something confident but unassuming about the way he said it. A man who was comfortable in his own presence. A man who didn't need to fill silence with meaningless words. I hesitated, but finally answered. I stopped. The name I had once said so easily, the name I had shared with him, felt foreign now. "I'm Anna." Peter smiled, slow and genuine. "Nice to finally meet you, Anna." I didn't smile back. I wasn't sure I remembered how, but I nodded. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. He didn't push for more, didn't pry into why I was out here alone. He just stood there, watching me in a way that felt steadying. I took a slow breath. My heartbeat had finally calmed, the rush of fear fading into something else, something unfamiliar. "I should get back," I said finally. Peter nodded, stepping back. Probably for the best. I wouldn't want to accidentally shoot my new neighbor. I gave him a dry look. "Yeah, that would be a bad start." A chuckle rumbled in his chest. "I'll be more careful next time." With that, he turned, heading back into the trees. I watched him disappear into the shadows before finally turning toward my own house, my thoughts tangled in a way they hadn't been in weeks. When I stepped inside, the silence didn't feel as heavy as it had before. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't entirely sure how I felt. The fire crackled softly in the small stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls of my cabin. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rustling the last stubborn leaves that clung to the branches. The night was quiet, untouched by the chaos of the world beyond these woods. And yet, my mind refused to be still. It had been weeks since I left everything behind, since I walked away from the life I had built, from the man I thought I knew. I told myself that solitude was what I needed, that being alone would help me heal. But I wasn't healing. The wound was still raw, a constant ache that settled in my chest like a dull knife. Some days I could almost forget, letting the silence of the forest soothe me, but then, out of nowhere, it would hit me again. The betrayal, the lies, the sheer audacity of it all. How had it all gone so wrong? I had given him everything. I had loved him in a way I didn't think I would ever love again. And in return, he had lied to my face, had twisted my trust into something disposable, something replaceable. A sharp exhale left my lips. Why was I even thinking about him? He was gone. He wasn't here, but someone else was. I shifted in my chair, staring into the fire, my fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of my sweater's sleeve. Peter. I hadn't meant to think about him. I barely even knew him. And yet, his presence lingered in my thoughts, uninvited but impossible to ignore. It had been so long since I met someone new, since I cared enough to notice someone beyond my own pain. The woods had been empty for years, just me, the silence, and the weight of my thoughts. And now, suddenly, there was him. Peter, the hunter, the neighbor I never knew I had. I scoffed under my breath, shaking my head at my own thoughts. What was I even doing? Why was I thinking about him, a stranger, a man, like I needed that in my life again? I wasn't ready, not for anything. And yet, something about him unsettled me, not in a bad way, but in a way I didn't quite understand. Maybe it was the confidence in his stance, the way he carried himself, or maybe it was the way he had looked at me, steady and unbothered by my cold demeanor, as if he saw something I couldn't. He wasn't like the man I had left behind. There was nothing charmingly polished about him, nothing rehearsed or too perfect in the way he spoke. He was rougher, more grounded, and something about that made me curious. I sighed, leaning back against the chair, running a hand through my hair. It didn't matter. I wasn't looking for anything. Not friendship, not comfort, not anything. But I also wasn't going to hide. If our paths crossed again, I wouldn't turn away. I wouldn't pretend he didn't exist. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just the simple fact that, after everything, I was tired of running. Either way, I had made up my mind. I wouldn't avoid Peter. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. I had barely slept. My mind had been restless, filled with fragmented thoughts that refused to settle. When I finally pulled myself out of bed, the house felt colder than usual, the empty space pressing in around me. I wrapped myself in a thick sweater and stepped outside, inhaling the crisp morning air. The sky was overcast, a pale gray that made the forest look almost surreal. It was eerily quiet, no birds, no wind, just stillness. I walked down the familiar path leading into the woods, my feet moving on instinct. This place had always been mine, the one place where I felt truly at peace. But lately, even here, I found no comfort. The weight of everything still sat heavy in my chest, an ache that refused to fade. I wasn't naive. I knew healing didn't happen overnight. But God, I was tired of feeling like this. I pushed deeper into the forest, the damp earth soft beneath my boots. My thoughts drifted as I walked, circling the same questions over and over. Had he ever really loved me? Or had I just been convenient? The thought made my stomach twist, and I forced myself to breathe, to focus on the present. But even then, my mind betrayed me, shifting to something, or rather, someone else. Peter. I frowned, shaking my head. I had only spoken to him once. It wasn't like he had done anything significant, and yet here I was, thinking about him. About the way he had looked at me, his gaze steady, unflinching. Most people got uncomfortable when faced with coldness. When I distanced myself, they tried to pull me back in, tried to coax warmth out of me. Peter hadn't. He had just accepted it. I wasn't sure what to make of that. I exhaled sharply, frustrated with myself. Why did it even matter? I didn't need another person in my life. I didn't want one. And yet, some part of me, the part I had buried under months of heartbreak and bitterness, felt something close to curiosity. What kind of man lived out here, in the middle of nowhere, just as I did? Had he, too, been running from something? I kicked at a loose rock on the path, annoyed with my own thoughts. It didn't matter. I wasn't going to seek him out, wasn't going to turn this into something more than what it was. But if I saw him again, well, I wouldn't walk away. The days passed in an easy, quiet rhythm. The solitude that once felt suffocating had started to feel manageable. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it didn't consume me the way it used to. I spent my mornings walking the trails, the afternoons reading by the fire, and my evenings listening to the distant sounds of the forest. I had no desire for company, no craving for conversation. I was finally learning to exist in my own silence. And then, one evening, there was a knock at the door. I froze. Nobody ever knocked on my door. For a brief, irrational moment, my heart pounded with the thought that he had found me. That somehow my past had followed me here. I forced a steadying breath and opened the door. Peter stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, that same easy confidence in his posture. The dim light from the house cast a warm glow against his features, making his sharp jawline seem even more defined. "Hey," he said, his voice steady, casual. "Figured I should finally do this properly." I raised a brow. "Do what?" "Invite you over." I hesitated. "I moved here about 2 years ago," he explained, tilting his head slightly. "But you weren't around, so I never got the chance to meet you. Thought I'd change that now." I glanced past him, toward the thick woods that separated our homes. He had lived here for 2 years, and I hadn't even known. When I didn't answer right away, he shrugged, his lips curving in the slightest hint of amusement. "It's not a big deal. Just a quiet little thing at my place this weekend. You know, a neighborly welcome." "Neighborly," I repeated, crossing my arms. Peter smirked. "It'll just be you, me, and my dog. Not much of a party, but I figured I'd try." Something about the way he said it made my lips twitch, almost betraying a smile. I could have said no. I could have turned him away and stayed locked in my self-imposed solitude. But something in me, maybe the part that was tired of being alone, didn't want to. "All right," I said finally. "I'll come." By the time Saturday arrived, I almost regretted saying yes. It had been so long since I'd willingly spent time with another person, let alone gone to someone's house for anything social. I stood in front of my mirror for longer than I should have, debating if I should put in any effort at all. In the end, I kept it simple. Jeans, a sweater, and my hair loosely pulled back. No makeup. No reason to pretend I cared more than I did. Peter's house was cozy, a warm contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. The scent of firewood and something faintly spicy, cinnamon maybe, drifted through the space. His dog, a large, fluffy mutt with bright eyes and an excited tail, bounded toward me the second I stepped inside. "This is Bear," Peter said, scratching behind the dog's ears as Bear practically melted under his touch. "He's been excited to meet you." I crouched slightly, letting Bear sniff my hand before giving him a few tentative pats. He immediately pressed against me, his tail wagging wildly. "Friendly," I murmured. "Too friendly," Peter corrected, shaking his head with amusement. "He doesn't get the concept of personal space." The evening was nice, easier than I expected. Peter didn't push, didn't prod into my past or my reasons for being here. We talked about simple things, the best places to hike, the unpredictability of the weather out here, how Bear had once chased a squirrel straight into a lake and had no regrets. It was the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe without the weight of everything pressing down on me. And then, the front door burst open. I jerked back instinctively as a familiar voice sliced through the warmth of the room like a blade. "So this is where you ran off to?" My stomach twisted into a knot. He stood there, disheveled, breath heavy with alcohol, eyes wild with something between anger and desperation. My ex. I hadn't seen him since the hospital, since I walked away. "What the hell are you doing here?" My voice was sharp, but my hands trembled at my sides. He let out a bitter laugh, gesturing toward Peter without looking at him. "So this is it, huh? You disappear for weeks and end up shacking up with some random guy in the woods? Real classy." Peter, to his credit, didn't react immediately. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a shift in his stance, subtle, protective. Bear, usually playful and unbothered, let out a low, warning growl. "You need to leave," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He ignored me. "You didn't even let me explain. You didn't let me say anything. And now I find out you're already moving on? Jesus, I bet you were screwing him while we were still together." Anger flared in my chest, burning through the fear. "Are you out of your mind? You're the one who lied. You're the one who cheated." His face twisted, ugly with resentment. "And you didn't even try to fix things." A sharp, cold laugh escaped me. "Fix things? You faked having cancer so you could cheat on me, and you think I should have fixed things?" Peter finally spoke. His voice was calm, but firm. "You need to go." My ex turned to him, eyes narrowing. "This isn't your business." Peter didn't flinch. "You came into my house and started yelling at my guest. That makes it my business." For a moment, I thought my ex would fight it, would keep pushing. But then he scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Whatever," he muttered, stepping back. "You were never worth the effort anyway." It shouldn't have hurt. I knew he was just trying to get the last word, to make himself feel better. But still, some part of me, some fragile, broken piece, flinched. And Peter saw it. The second my ex was gone, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" I swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Yeah, I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. I didn't think I'd ever see him again. Peter studied me for a long moment, then simply said, "He won't come back." Something about the certainty in his voice settled me. I sat down, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Peter grabbed 2 glasses from the counter and poured us both a drink, sliding one toward me. "To neighbors," he said lightly, as if the past few minutes hadn't just happened. I let out a small, breathy laugh, shaking my head as I lifted the glass. "To neighbors." And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel completely alone. The night my ex showed up was never mentioned again. Peter never brought it up, and I never asked. It hung there, unspoken between us, but not in a way that felt heavy or uncomfortable. More like a silent understanding. It happened, and now it was over. Days passed, blending into weeks, and my life slowly found a new rhythm. Only this time, something was different. Peter. It seemed like, no matter what I did, I kept running into him. If I went out for a morning walk, he'd be chopping firewood in his yard. If I went into town for groceries, I'd see him at the gas station, casually leaning against his truck like he had all the time in the world. And every time, we'd talk. It wasn't forced or awkward, just easy, natural, like we had known each other for much longer than we actually had. I started to look forward to those moments more than I wanted to admit. Somewhere along the way, we had become friends. And not just in a neighborly way, not just in polite, surface-level conversations. Real friends. We'd sit on his porch in the evenings, sharing stories over coffee. Sometimes I'd bring a book, and he'd listen while I read aloud, making sarcastic comments at all the dramatic parts. Other days, he'd teach me things: how to properly stack firewood, how to fix things around my cabin, how to hold a hunting rifle, even though I swore I'd never use one. We never planned it. It just happened. I told myself it was just friendship, that Peter was simply a good man who made my days a little less lonely. And then, one night, everything changed. I was at home, curled up on the couch, when there was a knock at the door. Peter. He stood there, hands in his pockets, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. His usual confidence was still there, but there was something else beneath it, something almost nervous. "I need to ask you something," he said. I raised a brow. "Sounds serious." "It is." He took a deep breath. Then, in the most Peter way possible, he just said it. "Go on a date with me." Silence. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. He wasn't joking. He wasn't smirking, wasn't teasing. He was just waiting. I opened my mouth, then closed it. My heart hammered in my chest, my mind racing. I should have expected this. I should have seen it coming. But I hadn't, because I had never let myself think about it. Peter was safe. He was steady. He had never given me a reason to second-guess him, never tried to push me into something I wasn't ready for. But a date? That was different. That meant something. And after everything I had been through, I wasn't sure I was ready. He must have seen the conflict in my face because he took a small step back, nodding slightly. No pressure, just thought I'd ask. That was what made me pause. He wasn't asking because he wanted something from me. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to be with me. Not out of pity, not out of convenience, because he liked me. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I liked him too. I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the edge of the door. "Okay," I said finally. His brows lifted slightly. "Yeah?" I nodded. "Yeah." The date was perfect, not in a grand romantic way, not in the kind of way my ex used to plan with expensive restaurants and forced perfection. No, this was different. Peter took me to the lake just outside of town. He packed a picnic, nothing fancy, just sandwiches and fruit and a thermos of coffee. Bear came along, trotting ahead of us, tail wagging excitedly as we walked along the shoreline. It was quiet, peaceful. And when we finally sat down on a blanket near the water, I felt it. The shift. I wasn't thinking about my past. I wasn't drowning in memories of betrayal, of hurt, of everything that had broken me. I was just there. With Peter. We talked, really talked, about life, about why he had moved out here, about things neither of us had shared before. And then, without hesitation, he told me the truth. "My ex cheated on me," he said, staring at the water. 2 years together, and one day, I came home early and found her with someone else. The honesty in his voice made my chest tighten. I didn't know what to do with myself after that, he continued. I didn't trust anyone, didn't want to, so I left. I swallowed hard. That's why you moved here? He nodded. Needed space. Needed to figure out who I was without her. The words hit harder than I expected, because I understood. More than anyone else, I understood exactly what he had gone through. The loss, the self-doubt, the crushing realization that someone you loved never truly valued you the way you valued them. For the first time, I wasn't alone in it. I exhaled softly, watching the ripples in the water. I get it, I murmured. Peter turned his head slightly, watching me. Yeah? I nodded. I thought I had forever with someone, and then, suddenly, I didn't. The words felt foreign coming out of my mouth. I had never said them out loud before. Peter didn't try to comfort me with empty reassurances. He didn't tell me I'd get over it or that it was his loss. He just listened, and somehow, that meant more than anything else. After that night, everything changed. We didn't rush anything. We didn't slap a label on it or try to force something that wasn't ready to happen. But we were closer. The walls I had built so carefully around myself started to crack, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. The first snowfall of the season dusted the trees in a delicate white blanket, turning the woods into something out of a dream. The air was crisp, fresh, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of winter. I stood on my porch, wrapped in a thick sweater, watching as the flakes drifted lazily from the sky. It had been weeks since that night by the lake, weeks since I had finally let someone in again. And now, I wasn't alone anymore. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind me. You're up early. Peter's voice was warm, laced with sleep. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, barefoot on the wooden floor, rubbing his eyes. His hair was a mess from sleep, his flannel shirt hanging loosely over his broad frame. Something about seeing him like this, so comfortable, so here, sent warmth curling through my chest. I smiled slightly. Couldn't sleep. He stepped outside, unfazed by the cold, and slid his arms around my waist, pulling me back against him. His body was solid, warm, a contrast to the chilly morning air. He murmured, pressing a lazy kiss to the top of my head. Guess I'll have to keep you warm then. I let out a soft laugh, leaning into him. It was still strange sometimes, this new feeling, this quiet, steady happiness. I had spent so long being afraid of love, afraid of letting someone in, terrified that I would lose myself again. But Peter had never asked me to be anything other than myself. With him, love didn't feel like a battle. It wasn't something I had to fight for, to prove, to beg for. It was just there. Easy, natural. And that, I realized, was what love was supposed to be. Later that evening, we sat curled up on the couch, Bear snoring at our feet. The fire flickered, casting a golden glow over the room, filling the space with warmth. Peter reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers. His touch was gentle, certain. You ever think about leaving this place? He asked suddenly. I frowned slightly. Leaving? Yeah, he said, tilting his head toward me. Not forever, just a trip, somewhere different. I hesitated. For so long, this cabin had been my sanctuary, my safe place, the only thing that felt like mine. The thought of leaving, even for a short while, made something twist in my chest. But then I looked at Peter, at the man who had waited for me to be ready, the man who had never asked for more than I was willing to give, who had met me exactly where I was. And I realized something. I wasn't hiding anymore. This place had once been my escape. But now? It was just home. Because home wasn't a cabin in the woods. It wasn't a place at all. It was him. A slow smile tugged at my lips. "Where were you thinking?" Peter grinned. "Somewhere warm. I'm sick of chopping firewood." I laughed, squeezing his hand. "Fine, but only if Bear gets to come." Peter groaned, but his eyes shone with amusement. "You're gonna spoil that dog rotten. He deserves it. You both do." There was something in his voice, something soft, unwavering. I met his gaze, and for the first time in my life, I didn't doubt the love I saw there. I didn't wonder if he meant it. I didn't fear that it would fade. I just knew. The following week, we packed up and left for a few days, just to see what it felt like. It was strange at first, being in a place that wasn't surrounded by endless trees, by familiar silence. But with Peter by my side, it didn't feel overwhelming. He made me laugh. Not the forced, polite kind of laugh, but real, genuine laughter. The kind I hadn't heard from myself in years. One evening, as we sat on a quiet beach, watching the waves roll against the shore, he turned to me, something unreadable in his gaze. "You're different," he murmured. I raised a brow. "Different how?" He studied me for a moment, his fingers brushing idly against mine. "When I first met you, you were guarded. You still are, in some ways. But now?" He smiled slightly. "You're lighter." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I saw it clearly. I had let go. Not of everything, not completely, but enough. Enough to laugh without feeling guilty. Enough to let myself love again. The realization hit me so suddenly, so profoundly, that I didn't even think before leaning in and pressing my lips to his. It was slow, deep, filled with all the words I didn't know how to say. When I pulled away, Peter exhaled a soft laugh, his forehead resting against mine. "Finally," he murmured. I smiled, shaking my head. "Shut up." We returned to the cabin a few days later, but everything felt different now. This place was no longer a hiding spot. It wasn't where I had run to. It was simply where I belonged. And Peter? He wasn't just someone I met after heartbreak. He was the reason I healed. One evening, as we sat outside watching the stars, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, delicate piece of folded paper. I frowned. "What's that?" He smirked slightly, handing it to me. I unfolded it, my breath catching as I recognized it immediately. One of my old love notes. Not from Peter. From my ex. I stiffened, but Peter just shrugged. "I found it in your closet a while back. Figured I'd keep it until you were ready." I swallowed, glancing down at the words, the same empty, meaningless words that had once meant everything to me. Slowly, deliberately, I tore it in half. Peter grinned. "That's my girl." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're ridiculous." He kissed my temple, his voice warm against my skin. "And you're finally free." And as I looked out at the vast, endless sky, at the world still waiting for me beyond the woods, I realized he was right. I was free. And this time, I was choosing love.